Hi, everybody. So when Pierpaolo originally asked me, I don't know if he said the same to everyone else, and when you were arranging it for last year, and it was at short notice, and I think you said something like, all of the historians have said no, but the architects, they're fine with it because they've got 2 weeks to prepare about some guy they've, maybe not that familiar with. So it's in that spirit, I think, that I stand here before you today. So it's not, well, it's partly an attempt for me to talk as an architect who deals with, I guess, the consequence of stuff around you and how that affects how one might make architecture. But it's also about, I suppose, the ways in which practitioners use history. So history as a partial, fragmented, subjective, imaginary body of stuff that can form arguments or references or hints about what you might do with a project or what you might do with the future. So the title is not quite right, but it is called In Praise of Bad Cover Versions. Not necessarily bad cover versions, all cover versions, but bad cover versions sounds better. Bad cover versions is, I think, more important because it's in the badness of the cover version that something new emerges. If the cover version is too good, then all you have is a replica. So I'm going to talk basically about the church next door to us and the book, and that's it, really. The reason I wanted to show you the church is because of its, I suppose, very clear relationship to a collection of historic fragments of architecture. What is it apart from a collection of historic fragments of architecture? You could even say this is it's architecture, sure, it's a building, yes, but is it an archive? Is it a collection? Is it, let's say, an assembly of fragments of history, albeit reconstructed? And these are just some of the things which it might be made up of. And this comes from, I do my research properly, this comes from Britannica Online, so it's a well-known source of architectural information. But the Solomon's Temple, the Pantheon, St. Paul's, Santa Sophia, and so on and so forth. I mean, clearly Trajan's Column also, and many other things. So it's a real kind of assemblage. And it's a building which is totally explicit about its sources, explicit about being a sum of parts. It's sort of like an architectural object. It's almost like, it almost feels like a series of souvenirs, like full-size souvenirs that you might have on your desktop, you might buy from a kiosk or something like that. So it's an archive of architecture, but it's definitely a kind of architecture which could only be made by an architect who spends a lot of their time looking at architecture, looking at the world, imagining the history of architecture and drawing the history of architecture. And out of that, let's say, repetition of what has come before, something new and different emerges. So I suppose, I think it's been talked about before, but there's an inherent kind of idea of power embedded in any project which might begin to try to make a map of the world on any subject. And because of that power, often the making of the map might start as a means of recording, but even as it begins to record, it alters and changes that very subject. So, in a sense, the way in which we make maps not only shows us the world, but also transforms the world. And we can think of that in all kinds of examples. Alfred Barr's diagram explaining, say, modern art as a sort of foundational document of MoMA, or a foundational document in the introduction of modernism to the US, which has a very clear and particular idea of culture and figures an idea of the artist as a kind of individual within a world. The other slide is the frontispiece of a book we get referred to at the beginning of architectural studies in the UK, Sir Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture. Amazing that a guy whose first name is, a tiny piece of architecture, Bannister. It's nominative determinism, I think we call it. But you can see here that the image of the tree, again, but what is a kind of productive part, what's central, what's close to the trunk, what is a twig, and what is sort of external, or the very outer limbs, of course, is clearly also an image of how Sir Bannister Fletcher, Imperial Britain, imagined the world. Very clearly in Jenks's diagrams, which start with history and then project forwards, we see him kind of using that idea. The map becomes not only a way of showing you what happened, but also of directly predicting the future. And certainly in some of, in terms of the sum of the effect of this diagram, it changed, the course of where architecture ended up. So if that's kind of conceptual ideas of where do things come from, what's related to what, genealogies and family trees and so on and so forth, you could also say it's the production of the image which is really important. And clearly that's central to Fischer's project. And we can think of many examples where the making of drawings depicts, but it also transforms what is then made. So Piranesi, in his kind of drawings of Rome, partly observed, partly imaginary, become a world unto themselves. It's Rome, but it's also Piranesian Rome. Or the Antiquities of Athens, Stewart and Revitt's book, which measured fragments of antiquity, published it, and allowed people who had never travelled outside of the United Kingdom to begin to build with kind of classical reference. So that these kinds of drawings become incredibly generative, they become incredibly provocative, and they begin to change what it's possible to even imagine within the field of architecture. I think it's also a point also that's been made is that the publication, the drawing, the book, the image, becomes the site of, let's say, the architectural possibility, the architectural kind of idea. And that somehow buildings and media become very intertwined. So drawings, later photographs, books, magazines, I suppose now screens, become fundamental to, let's say, the production of architectural ideas. And I think, this means not going to see the source, not really knowing something beyond the page or the screen. The partial, let's say, understanding of something, the bad cover version, becomes, in certain hands, certain moments, a very creative moment. So I suppose, one question is what is the site for that now? How do we, where are we assembling our archives and our collections? And clearly that's on screens, it's on platforms. Are we doing it individually? Are we doing it collectively? And how are those streams of images that we scroll through every day, Mark, like you're doing it now, how will they, or how are they transforming the ways in which we produce architecture? I suppose this is to do with the amount of stuff, like the kind of mania that drives someone to want to illustrate, the history of architecture. And what that mania can then produce. Clearly it was part of the, let's say, the sensation and the experience the Grand Tour, the English aristocracy in a kind of orgy of culture, frantic, looking, experiencing, and acquiring. It didn't really matter if it was original or a souvenir, if it was real or imagined. It just mattered that you could collect it all together and take it home. And I suppose that Stendhal syndrome, that kind of mental sickness that tourists suffer in the presence of too much overwhelming beauty, is part of this. Like being able to see everything all at once is a let's say a kind of a strange mental state, which produces, I think, another way of thinking. I mean, we can see all kinds of examples of this. This is the sort of personal mania of John Soane, where not only the design of his own sort of house and office, but also the collections of stuff that he placed within it becomes incredibly intense as a spatial experience, but also as a narrative experience, as a way of Soane constructing his own idea of the history of architecture, one that you can walk through, one you can feel, one that he could use to broadcast his own ideas. And of course, he was well aware of, let's say, the kind of the power contained within that in his essay, where he describes his own house in ruins, crude hints, where he's talking about basically archaeologists from the future coming upon the ruins of this place and what they might speculate they had found. So he was kind of very self-conscious in the way that he was placing himself in a kind of historic lineage and how he was constructing that lineage and how he saw himself as a kind of a future, let's say, the future author of the ruins of the future, an author of the ruins of the future. Other kind of manias which certainly come out of the context within which they're made. This is just 3 plates of Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament. So this is like kind of the height of English imperialism, where Jones collects together the compendium of patterns from across kind of global culture. You can see at the center, savage tribes. So as much as he might try to escape, let's say, the circumstance of time and space, of course, it's impossible to do that. So we see representations not only of patterns, but we also see representations of a Victorian idea of world culture. I mean, it's interesting to see also something which happens with Jones is, despite all of this difference, despite trying to include everything in the world, in the tiny world of pattern making, it also begins to look exactly the same because of the way that he processes it, the way that he kind of cuts it up, the way that he puts it together as a graphic effect. So really, time and space begin to become one thing. But you could also say, is that part of, let's say, a Victorian imperialist idea? Of course, in some ways, it is. These books, of course, become pattern books, and they're used to change taste, not only displays within the Crystal Palace, the Great Exhibition, 1851, but in kind of wider tastes of the new consumer classes. Well, that mania perhaps is also exemplified here in San Rocco's Book of Copies, which is collections of people's collections of things which have influenced them or they would like to influence them. Like just too much stuff to process. So a little bit like walking into the Soane Museum and you feel these waves of stuff that you cannot even necessarily compute. It's the same sensation leafing through the copies of the Book of Copies. So all of these, I suppose, are compendiums of architectural references. And I think they all have the same task. They're intended to both expose inspiration, like these are the things which we use, or these are the things we're interested in, but also to instigate it, so that there's a sort of generative quality to the fact that all of this stuff is just held together in one point in space, in one volume. So I suppose the question as a as an architect, as a designer, is what do we do with those maps or with those images or all of those collections and those references? What did Fischer do in the church next door with them? Well, I'm going to give you two options, basically. The first option is you can perform cover versions. Now, cover versions, I suppose, something strange happens, right, when you do a cover version. So you're putting yourself in relationship with something which already exists in the world. And what you're doing is a kind of act of interpretation and a kind of projection. So it's sort of theatrical in a sense. Maybe you're trying to imitate the source, or maybe you're trying to somehow inject your own reading. Are you trying to assume a different identity? And if you are you also erasing another identity? So you could say, all of the arguments about appropriation of African American music at the beginning of rock and roll. You could think of the Rolling Stones as a 60-year blues cover band, or whatever. I mean, the cover version, of course, we also know can operate as a form of critique, of a reading of the thing itself. So it can be a song which is about a song which interprets another song. And in that sense, can we also understand architectural cover versions as sort of architecture about architecture, architecture which can help us understand architecture because it's so aware of performing its role as a piece of architecture. So I suppose this is the question. Maybe we can answer it at lunch. We can go and sit outside the church. Are these a collection of cover versions? And if so, what kind of cover versions? They're definitely replicas, remakes to some extent, but are they all equal? So I think there's an incredible, let's say, nuance of sensibility in the production of replicas, the production of copies, and the performance of a cover version. And here are maybe some more explicit cover versions. The Villa Rotunda, and one of its copies in Nablus in the Palestinian territories. St. Peter's and Our Lady of Peace in Yamoussoukro, in Ivory Coast. The reconstruction of the Frauenkirche. The reproduction of Hallstatt in China. So all of those are kind of re-performances of things which already exist or already existed. Each time it's done, it's for a different reason and maybe produces a different kind of meaning. Not all copies are made equal, for sure. So this is your second option. If you're not up for cover versions, then maybe you want to try some sampling. So what happens when we begin to use the cultural idea of sampling? Well, we begin with wholes, and then we turn those wholes into fragments. We take them apart carefully, and we dissect them into discrete elements. So we take things out of their context, and then we use that to reassemble, I suppose in a different order, with adjacent to other pieces, something new. And when we hear that sample in its new context, I suppose we often hear it as its original fragment, still recognizable, yet it's within a new whole, to a new distinct entity. So it can be both a part and a whole simultaneously. And I think if we look at the elevation of the church, that's exactly what we see. But we can see also traditions of architecture which work exactly within this context. So new forms of architecture made out of different architectural limbs sewn together with body parts of others. So on the far side is John Soane's pasticcio, which is literally made out of fragments. This is in the courtyard of his house. So these are different pieces of original bits of building stacked up to make a kind of mythical and imaginary monument. In the middle is an imaginary drawing by Joseph Gandhi of a building which essentially is the history of architecture from a certain moment. Every floor you go up is a different era. And then this, which was my version of a pasticcio made in response to a brief that Mark Lee set a group of us in the Chicago Biennial a number of years ago. So in each of these cases, I suppose you recognize the fragment, but you also see the new whole that has been generated. So pieces taken out of context and placed together according to maybe alternative logics or alternative rhythms, but certainly producing new meanings out of the act of juxtaposition. Here we see certainly an assemblage of found architectural elements to form an entirely new meaning. So I'm going to conclude. I hope you'll excuse. This is definitely an architect's talk about architectural history. It's, I suppose, a love letter to bad cover versions, to sampling, and to all of the new things that could be made out of the old fragments that we find around us. I think one of the questions in the pamphlet, Per Paolo, was why does Fischer feel so modern? And it's certainly, I think, some of the sensibility of this sort of use of the historic, the use of the fragment, and the reassembly of pieces of culture to make new bodies with new meanings, which feels incredibly modern. You know, if our references are, you know, Instagram, Google Images, the fragmentary nature of information which surrounds us, and the question that we might have is how do we respond to that field of images and phrases that form contemporary culture, then one of the questions is how we formulate, let's say, more coherent responses to that fragmentary field. I think it's also maybe a question of where one might see creativity and where one might see originality. And I think what Fischer shows us and what certain, let's say, ideas to do with the cover version and the sample show that creativity and originality can come from looking at, thinking about, and responding to the world rather than an effort to invent the original. And one of the things which occurs through that process is that the innovations which are made are somehow more engaged with the world because they're always made in relationship to the culture which already surrounds us. So it means that creative acts can become means of, I suppose, critiquing, engaging, and rethinking where we are and what we might be doing. Thank you very much.